Okay, so hi all. Welcome to today's webinar on When AI Goes Bad by Richard. So I welcome all the participants for this webinar who's joined us, although we had slight technical issues. So here's a quick introduction about Richard. So Richard has been a national solution architect in the digital transformation practice at Sogeti. In that role, he has led major architecting efforts at a number of Sogeti clients, resulting in creative solutions to difficult problems, winning client loyalty and business. Richard has also been involved in architecting solutions in space, including high-speed networking, image compression, VoIP telephony, ACIS design, radio communications, and consumer products, among others. He holds patents in the areas of image compression and high-speed network processing methods. So, Richard, welcome you to the webinar. So, we are starting off with the series of top blog webinars from today. So, yours being the blog which had the maximum number of views. So, over to you, Richard, to take us through the topic.
Well, thank you, and thanks for that introduction. And we are recording here, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Very good. As I said the other day, I'll try to be on my best behavior here. So, well, thank you all for attending this inaugural event, and I feel rather honored to be the first one giving it. Although that's a bit of pressure, so forgive me if I stumbled a few times here in this process. But apparently there was enough interest in the topic around the blog that I posted that it seemed like there was a topic here to mine for more content and more discussion. So I wanted to spend a little time talking about this. Before I get into it, I want to say something about why this topic is of interest to me and why I think by the end of this discussion it should be of interest to you as well. We are all great technologists. We're very good at what we do, each in our own areas, and in general. We're very good at delivering value to the client. We're very good at doing what we do as shapers of the world in a digital form. I think sometimes what we don't think about, and what I do like to spend time thinking about, are the impacts of what we do and what we allow our clients to do with the technological solutions we bring to them. The societal implications of a number of areas of technology are quite broad these days, as we all know. And I want to focus on at least one of those for this talk today. Now, I want to pause for a second and say, for context, I'm not suggesting in any of what I'm about to talk about here that either technology per se is not a good thing. I don't want to think it's either unalloyed good or bad in its impact. But raise the issues that, number one, we should be thinking about as both as individuals and as a society about the impacts of what we're doing. And secondly, taking steps where we can to minimize the negative impacts and maximize the positive impacts here. So I really want to, in that blog that I posted and in the presentation I give today, make you think a little bit about this from a slightly different perspective than you may on a day-to-day basis. The topic of the blog that I posted was about when AI has problems, and I gave a specific example in that blog. I will talk a little bit about that, but I'm also going to spend some time talking about some other areas here and spend a little time talking about how we might categorize our thoughts around this and giving some examples of, hopefully at the end, how we might affect the discussion and how we might affect the outcome here. So with that, let me continue on. Let's start out by giving a short history of AI. Let me pause for a minute to say, in this conversation, I'm not distinguishing AI from machine learning. I'm using that term very, very broadly. And I know technically speaking and specifically, there are differences between those. For purposes of this discussion today, I'm lumping those all together in terms of AI. So let's talk about how AI got started, which will help us think about some of the people who led the effort and what they had to say about this process. So how did AI get started? Well, really, this is one interesting area where fiction led reality. In the first half of the 20th century, there were a number of science fiction stories and fiction stories in general that introduced the idea of robots that were artificially intelligent. Now, it's interesting to note that the only way that it was possible for people to think of this back in those days was if that artificial intelligence looked like and acted like a human intelligence. We know that doesn't have to be the case today, but that's most of the context in which discussion around this topic took place. Now, the real first foray into what became essentially the technical grounding for AI was laid by the person we all know as one of the fathers of computing, Alan Turing, in his paper Computing Machines and Intelligence, in which he described what it would be like to have an intelligent deterministic machine. And he didn't speak much in that paper, but spoke later about some of the potential implications of that. By the way, with the graphic that you see here, it is very interesting to realize that most people think that the Turing paper talked about being able to tell the difference between a human and a computer in a discussion where the questioner had no information of the look of the answer to the questions, etc. In reality, the first version of this question of what an intelligent machine would look like and how to tell one was predicated on asking questions of either a man or a woman and trying to decide when the questioner which was which. He used this as the example for that. So just an interesting aside to the fact that the Turing paper didn't talk specifically about telling the difference between humans and non-humans so much as not being able to tell the difference between different types of intelligent individuals. Now, the real technical grounding for this actually happened back in 1956. So we're already 60 years past the first proof of concept for AI. And that was done with a program called the Logic Theorist, which could do some theorem proving and exploration of spaces with simple AI. Now, this was not neural network based, etc., so very deterministic, but at least this paper laid the groundwork, and this working POC laid the groundwork for what would later become the basis for all artificial intelligence work we do today. And we all know where we are at the moment. You know, we've had some slowdowns along the way, some wrong turns. As early as 1970, a number of researchers were claiming that in 5 years we'd have intelligent machines that could pass the Turing test and would be impossible to tell from humans. In reality, that was a little bit too optimistic. But we do now have AI programs that are fairly general in nature and that can be humans in a number of cases. We all know about Watson. We all know about Watson playing Jeopardy, which is a U.S. quiz show game, and winning. And also earlier than that in Deep Blue that was able to beat a chess master in a number of games. So that indicates that we've come quite a long way from thinking that it was a robot who was going to look and act like a human to something that doesn't even look like a human, but actually can best us at specific things. Okay. Let's talk about some uses of AI today, just so we establish the groundwork here. And what's important about this part of the discussion is that knowing where AI is being used says something about where the potential benefits and downsides are that we will need to look out for. So I'll just go through these quickly. And some of these are very interesting to me. AI in healthcare, there's actually been work done at Stanford University that has applied AI to the problem of reading chest x-rays for evaluation of whether a patient has pneumonia or not. That's a very difficult thing to do, and it takes years of training for a doctor, a radiologist, to learn to do this. In reality now, sometime about 2 years ago, the program that the Stanford team developed was able to outperform radiologists in terms of looking for patients who had indications of pneumonia. So just an indication of how well we're doing there. Pharmaceuticals have been using computer power for a while, and AI is allowing an unguided exploration of spaces for new drugs. And you can see here that, that some companies have been able to use AI to improve the rates at which they can find new potential drugs. I want to point out potential drugs here by factors of thousands, and can go through millions of components. And as we probably all know, these days, drug design has gotten to the point where it is all computer aided, and we know enough about what certain patterns of molecules what effect they'll have on the human body. And with all of the billions of different versions of the different molecules, the only way to actually be able to find new drugs and take them to clinical trials in reasonable numbers is to find them, explore that space, and then make reasonable inferences about what their biological activity would be. So AI has improved this remarkably. I did not know about this one until I did some research, but we all are not surprised that computers are used in the financial services industry. Computer algorithms do trading these days in nanoseconds, in times measured in nanoseconds. So that's not a surprise. But there are actually companies out there, Betterment is one of them, that does automated financial investing. So rather than having a stockbroker or an investment advisor, human, taking care of your money, this is a case where companies are offering the ability for AIs to do this for you. And as you can see here, there are billions of dollars under management. Lots of people being served by this, which I wasn't aware of. And actually, the returns here are pretty good because this process can be automated. The AI can explore potential investments and game them out in ways that just outpace what humans can do. Now, social media is an interesting one as well. We're probably most familiar with Facebook, Twitter, and a few others who are using AI to apply to the problem of behavioral data recognition, used perhaps in a negative way to target ads and marketing and the like, to be used in a positive way to combat spam and abuse, to tell if what you've got on your Facebook or Twitter account is a spam bot, which kind of raises the interesting problem of an arms race in AI. The spam bots are often AI-based as well. But there's an opportunity to use AI to fight this problem by analyzing a user's online activity, by being able to do natural language processing and figure out whether or not this is a real person or not a real person, and whether they're behaving properly in the context of the platform. This is one which was near and dear to my heart. As a pilot myself, the use of AI in aeronautics has gotten very, very interesting. This quote here, I thought, said it all. The person who's piloting your plane may no longer be what we'd think of traditionally as a pilot who's using information from otherwise fairly simple instruments to pilot this complex device through the sky. That's sort of flipped now, and most of the flight control systems are fairly intelligent and are able to functionally fly the plane themselves. It's possible these days for a plane to be flown by computer, by an AI program, from takeoff to landing. And the pilot and the co-pilot are really there just to babysit the system and to make sure that optimal flight conditions are met, to make changes that are required by changes in weather or traffic patterns and the like, though I would expect that to be replaced soon enough as well. And the pilot's there to essentially handle the aberrant conditions that it may be much to ask for an AI to do. And we all know from the blog that I posted that the outcome of that can be less than ideal. So those are just some examples. We know they're all over the place. AI is in use in chat bots, in a number of different areas that have gotten to the point or are rapidly getting to the point where AI is everywhere, and the risk being that it's so well hidden that we don't even know it's there and don't know that it can create problems for us. Okay, so let me just give you a couple examples of where I think that we've got AI and machine learning that has a downside, and that there have been downsides to these things. And I don't want to say here that all of these examples are examples of why we should not trust AI in charge of certain things, but just a reminder that it's not without its perhaps darker and deeper implications. So a couple of years ago, I think it's a couple of years now, there was an Uber self-driving SUV that was in Arizona that struck. It was at night. It struck and killed a pedestrian. And basically, what we can say about that is that although the driver could be said to be at fault because the driver is supposed to be monitoring this at all times and wasn't, the AI system was confused about the fact that there was a pedestrian there or not, and because of the way things were set up, did not react in time to avoid hitting and killing a human individual. There are many, many things that can be talked about here in terms of self-driving cars and AI and the upsides and downsides. I may write a blog about that in the future because that's an interesting topic to me as well, which is there are a number of philosophical problems with this, which is, for instance, if a self-driving car has to make a decision between hitting and killing one younger person or an older person, can the car tell the difference? Can the AI tell the difference? What would the AI do in terms of making that decision? Would it make a decision like a human would? And even if it would, are we going to think of it as being a killer machine because it's making the decision and not human? So there's a whole interesting issue there that has to do with, I think, philosophy that I'll be glad to talk about at some time. Here's one that was kind of interesting to me. Amazon tested out and eventually decided not to deploy a machine learning algorithm for going through the massive numbers of CVs and resumes that they get for their positions in order to thin it down so that human HR people can look through a smaller group of potential recruits before sending them on through a rather expensive and lengthy process. Well, the problem was that, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, the problem was here that the AI algorithm learned to be rather sexist because it was trained on data sets in which most, if not all, of the hires were male, and therefore it was trained to look for maleness, signs of maleness, as being signs of a good hire. So it got to the point where the algorithm was actually looking through CVs to see if there were sports and what sort of extracurricular activities the potential recruit did, and if there was any hint that those might be things that women did more than men, they would be kicked out of the pool. So the program learned to be sexist, unfortunately. And I think rather than go ahead, Amazon decided to shut that one down rather than try to solve that problem. I think that was actually a mistake. I think in the long run that could have served them. Perhaps they will bring it back, but it's a reminder and a warning about the downsides of technology and AI in particular if we're not careful to understand how it's working, how it's being trained, and what it's picking up from us. Here's another one that you probably all heard about. This was a Microsoft chatbot project that was connected to Twitter in order to watch Twitter streams, learn something about the contents of discussions, be able to take part in discussions, be able to start discussions. And unfortunately, a group of people took advantage of the open nature of this thing and actually sent it some pretty vile tweets and trained it to become fairly racist. So within 24 hours, that chatbot, that AI chatbot, had become a flaming racist on Twitter, Microsoft had to shut it down and got a lot of bad press for that. So another interesting one. Here's a use of technology that I was very surprised by, that to me just says there's still this human drive to use technology without thinking about how it's being used. An Israeli company a couple of years ago called Faceception said that they had developed an AI algorithm that could predict intelligence from facial recognition technology. Now, for those of you who know what phrenology is, that is a pseudoscience that crept up in the mid-19th century US, in which a large number of scientists thought incorrectly that it was possible to tell something about the intelligence of the person from the shape of their head, from the bumps on it, etc. A sort of genetics equals destiny view of the world. It was ultimately clear that that was pseudoscience. However, it's popped back up again, and AI has been used to automate that process. This is probably the flip side of having an open culture in which we explore any number of areas where we can use AI, that there are going to be uses of AI for things that are essentially ridiculous pseudoscience or others. But an interesting downside of that. The company's roundly been castigated for this in the news. I'm not sure the product is still available, although it's probably just gone underground. But there you go. And then there is that Lion 610 flight that I wrote the blog about, which essentially comes down to the following. The computer was making the best decisions that it thought with the data it had at the time. And there's an interesting topic, which AI programs are necessarily limited in their decision-making process by the data that they have access to, as we all are. But as humans, we have, in general, access to a wider range of data than the computer does, because we can only give it the data that we are aware at the time we're designing and building the system that it will need to make its decisions. And we may be wrong about that. So in this case, although there were indications to the humans that there was a problem with the flight, with a flight regime, and that it was headed down when it shouldn't, the AI system was limited in what it had access to. It had a faulty sensor. It made what the programmers and what it had been trained to make as what it thought was the best decision, which ultimately ended up killing all the people on the flight, even though the crew valiantly tried to save the day. One interesting aside about this, by the way, is this is probably as much a problem with training as it is with AI, because the pilots were not well trained in how to take the system offline. So basically they weren't able to do that, and they were fighting the system all the way down. Okay, so with all that kind of as background, and I know that was a little bit perhaps boring, but a lot of areas in which AI gets used, the history of AI, and some examples of problems that have been seen. Before we can approach this, let's see if we can categorize the problems a little bit, the potential problematic areas for AI. Okay, and I won't say that these are my original thoughts. I've picked these up from other places, but I think this is a good way to I think there are 5 or 6 categories to categorize these problems so we know how to approach them. The first one is what can be thought of as AI can create hidden problems. Now, in computer programs that we do on a daily basis, that we code ourselves, etc., that's all deterministic programming, and is at least possible in theory to prove the outcome of the program, the decision of the program, as it were, for any set of decidable inputs. We can make informed decisions about those. We can test for those, etc. We can try to handle the negative outcomes in positive ways. And in theory, at least, we can do that fully, 100%. Although in reality, it's never quite that much. But it's deterministic programming. AI has statistical representations of the world and dynamic statistical representations of the world that are built up over time, initially with training sets, and then eventually with real-world data that on which it's given some human feedback typically. Well, that can create hidden problems, because not being able to fully and deterministically predict the behavior of the program there may be problems in there, such as, for instance, the airline problem, in which testing testing it's either difficult or impossible for testing to find those problems. So we've got to be aware of this, and we'll talk later about how we deal with each of these problem categories, but we've got to be aware of the fact that AI can create hidden problems, hidden in the sense that we may suspect they're there, but we can't necessarily find, discover, explain, and mitigate against. And we need to be very, very careful about that. Second category, I think, is, and this is a small one, but one I thought was important to talk about, which is that AI can lead to a loss of critical thinking skills. And I don't mean that we're all going to become idiots as members of society when AI becomes more and more prevalent, but we may have a natural reaction to say, well, AI can take care of that, so I don't really have to think about that outcome. And that's important because it's not that we're going to become stupid, but that we stop thinking about certain things because the machines appear to be so good at it that we no longer think we have to deal with those problems anymore. And I think that's an important one to have in mind as well. Okay. So not only can AI create hidden problems, it may lead to a loss of critical thinking on the problems that we do have. AI can open new hazards. Here's the way I like to think about it. With deterministic programming, we're all aware of security, and although we may not work in that area, we know that there are steps that can be taken in deterministic programming environments to mitigate and protect against those attacks. For number one, we're aware of most of those potential attack surfaces, and we can mitigate against them because they are a limited in number. Because AI, if you will, in its highest form, can act and think as humans do, in some sense it is potentially targetable as humans would be. So, for instance, AI doing, let's say, for instance, sentiment analysis of Twitter streams in order to be able to figure out and make a decision about product placements or something similar to that. Well, nefarious actors can exploit those in ways that wouldn't be possible and in ways that wouldn't be easy to mitigate if this is an AI-based system. So, for instance, we saw that in the case of the racist Twitter bot, where in order to be effective, it had to have access to large numbers of Twitter streams, and it had to act like a human in some sense, although in a more limited sense. And in listening to a large number of people who decided to take advantage of this, it essentially became a hardcore racist. That's a hazard that we wouldn't see in a deterministic program, but we will see and will continue to see in many ways in AI-based programs, because of the fact that they are more quote-unquote human-like in their decision-making process and have more distributed and less visible attack surfaces, less obvious ones. And as the second sentence in that one says, that wouldn't be a big deal if this were just a racist Twitter bot that needed to be taken down and cleaned up from time to time. But with AI making decisions in the financial services sector, in the medical and healthcare sectors, these new hazards can have particularly horrific outcomes that we need to be aware of. Okay. Uses as an example the Amazon AI that plowed through CVs and resumes in order to find candidates. We have to be really careful to be aware that AI can institutionalize our biases. A lot of the sales pitch around AI uses is often that it takes the human element out, and as a result takes the human biases and negative parts of the human experience out, and makes it possible to have essentially a fair outcome, if you will. Well, yes and no. Since AI is basically trained usually by curated data sets, who curates those data sets? It's humans. And if we're not careful about that, and we choose bad data sets to train on, or if we don't fully understand the model and what can happen with changes to the data that's fed to it, we may put bias into a system that may either be invisible to us or may, in the case of the Amazon program, may be visible to us, but may be difficult to deal with. An example of this for me is I wrote a blog several months back in which I talked about an AI program that's used here in the States to determine sentencing guidelines for those who are convicted of criminal offenses. It takes a lot of data about the offender's history, about where they live, about the type of the crime, about the severity of the crime, and tries to offer to the judge in the case a recommended sentence. The problem with that is it's pretty clear it's become somewhat racist itself in terms of determining sentencing, and without looking into it, which was only done a few years ago initially by some investigators, we may think that the system is being fair when in reality it was pretty clear it wasn't being fair. The problem here, as you'll see if you go back and look at that blog that I wrote, is that this still hasn't been dealt with yet, that particular case. And so there's an example of where I think also we begin to cede the thinking of the process to the machines without thinking about whether or not that's necessarily a good thing. Okay. And here's another one that I think is important to us. We don't talk about empathy much in our jobs, but we need to be aware of the fact that AI can kind of put a layer between, let's say, business owners and consumers, or government officials and citizens, that can allow a loss of empathy. For instance, if I'm a government official and I am, let's say, to go back to the example, relying on the sentencing program to make decisions, I may simply cede even my thinking about that to the AI and become less empathetic to the outcome of the use of that program on real people's lives. So this is also a concern I think that we need to be aware of. Okay. All right. One more, sorry. And we can also, I think this sort of folds into the others, but also I think that AI can lead to a loss of control. And this, I think this probably is duplicate of what I said earlier, but there are things that we tend to think as humans that we are better suited for philosophical, ethical, moral reasons, certain decisions. And there will be a drive, I think, to apply AI to those as well. And we have to be careful that we don't lose control over what are some important human decisions. Okay. This is just my what I call my apocalyptic slide. I personally think we've reached or are soon to reach a tipping point in which we need to have some very serious societal conversations about these matters. The problem with that is, and I'll talk a little bit later about the fact that these are difficult problems philosophically, but also technically. And unless we have people who are able to understand the technology sufficiently to lead these conversations, they're likely to go nowhere. So we need to be careful about that. But given that, in any case, I think we've reached a tipping point where AI is becoming sufficiently distributed in our daily lives that we really need to begin discussions about these and come to some kind of conclusions. And if we don't, then we may be on a road to the situation where the AI takes over. And I don't want to sound too apocalyptic there. And Skynet and the Terminator are a bit of a joke. We don't expect that to actually happen. But it's a reminder that we need to really have this discussion, and we need to be prepared for what this technology can do to us, both good and bad. I am a bit of a cynic and a bit of a pessimist on these things. I am concerned we are reaching that point without having that conversation, and yet at the same time hopeful that we can do something about it. What can we do? I would argue that we need to start the discussion, but we need to have it with both technical and social leadership at the head of that discussion, acting as proxies for us. I think in some cases we have social leadership, but they don't understand the technology and therefore can't make rational decisions about it. And we do have some technologists out there who are trying to start that discussion, usually in less than effective ways. For instance, Elon Musk is convinced that there is an AI apocalypse coming and is concerned about that. That's not terribly helpful. He's approaching it from a technological perspective without much understanding, I believe, that there is a drive and a need for using this kind of technology to better humanity. And so it's going to happen, and it's important that we make it happen in the right way. Um, there are some discussions taking place about this. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, in conjunction with a few other groups, published a report recently. I think that was in late 2017, early 2018, that actually laid out the issues for this in this area, and also discussed what could be done to mitigate some of these. Their concern focused mainly on the geopolitical area, but also encompassed some of the commercial uses, potentially the commercially bad uses that AI can be put to. Very interesting report. I've scanned it. I'd recommend that you take a look at it too. It's actually a good starting point for this discussion. The link is in the slide set that will be sent out later. And then another report, which is really about, again, where this technology could go and what its implications are. No answers in either of these things about specifically what to do, but at least they have started the conversation. And there are others. What can be done with this information? We can have discussions all day, but unless there's some outcome, some action that's taken, et cetera, it's all just an academic exercise. Well, I would argue that really what it comes down to, and what all of these reports recommend, is that we consider regulatory frameworks, both on a nation-state level and also on a global level, to make sure that we're thinking carefully about how AI should be managed, where it should be, in a way that's healthy, preventative of negative outcomes, and yet doesn't interfere with what essentially is capitalist societies in the world. And a general movement upward. The Conference on Artificial Intelligence, Ethics, and Society had something to say about that in a report that came out last year, and I'd be glad to provide the URL to that. One quote about that was from one of the EU commissioners that was on this. I think that's worth thinking about, which is that when we deploy AI, his argument is that we need to have a set of core principles, perhaps something like Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, if you're a science fiction fan, in which all AI is based on a set of rules, a framework that controls what it can do, how it can do that, how humans interact with it, and provide the largest benefits possible while mitigating negative outcomes. Okay. Now, here's where it's interesting to me. These are all the things I've said before about the discussions we can have, et cetera. Those are all large-scale, very impactful things that will take time, but a little bit distant from us in our day-to-day jobs. So I also want to think about, and I do on a regular basis, think about what I can do as an individual technologist. And that is, in some senses, actually even a tougher problem. And you'll see why in a second. Here's the first and most important thing. Sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as much as anyone, I focus strictly on the technology that I'm asked to use in my daily life. I will learn a new framework. I will learn a new language. I will learn new methodologies. I will learn new architectures that are directly related to how well I do my job. But I won't take the time to pause and reflect on what those technologies mean to the wider society. And I think the starting point there is to have that sense as a context of what we think about and who we are, and then take time to educate ourselves on these issues so that we're at least conversant about them and we can take part in the conversation. And more importantly, we can help guide the conversation. And what these look like to me is that we can learn what is meant by taking an ethical approach to AI, to the use of AI. And as I said, earlier, we do our job, and we're all very, very good at it. But unless we have that ethical framework to work within, we don't have any way of approaching this issue of what the technology means to society as a whole. So taking time to educate ourselves, I think, on these matters is fairly important. There are many starting points. I can provide them to you, some very good things that are more focused on technologists, but also introduce us to the concepts of what ethics and means and what philosophical problems we have to deal with in this. The second thing is we can take part in the discussions within society because we are subject matter experts. And I think what that looks like to me is that we can take part in the discussions in our respective countries with governmental issues. We can make our voices heard because we will be listened to. We are subject matter experts on the technology. And as we've seen, and this is a little US centric, I've seen over the last couple of years, my elected representatives try to have discussions about technology and its implications, and they get it horribly wrong because they clearly don't understand how the technology works, and they have this very, very strange view of what the technology is and what it's capable of doing and what it's not capable of doing. So our role here is to take part in these discussions and be translators from the technology to the non-technologists and the people in the real world. And this is tough to do, but it's something that we can all take some part in. And to me, I actually find this very powerful to be that translator. I have a chance to affect the outcome of these discussions on a societal level and to make sure that they are made mindfully based on not a comic book view of what the technology does and is capable of, but in fact, what it is really like, and describing it in a way that non-technical people can understand. Now, here's the really tough part for all of us, which is we're there to do a job. We are there to provide advice to our clients and direction on how to solve their technology problem. We don't typically see ourselves as being there to discuss the ethical and moral implications of what they're doing. I would argue that that's a mistake, and that what we really need to do is think about how we can, in ways perhaps subtle, affect how our clients think about using the technology that we bring to them. I don't mean that we do these sort of we take the action that we often see in these movies, these hero-like movies, where the hero manages to stop the evil corporation from using technology in a way that's not going to be to the benefit of society. That doesn't really happen, and that's not what we're there for, and it'll get us kicked out fairly quickly in favor of somebody who will simply do the job. But I think in more subtle ways we can affect that outcome. In one particular way that occurs to me, if we are introducing a new technology to a client, let's say AI in particular, but there are many others, we can, as part of the conversation, bring up subjects around what is happening in the regulatory world with regard to uses of technology. We can bring up discussions about events in the real world in which the technology has been used or misused. We can start those kinds of discussions in a way, in an attempt to affect the outcome of the decision without directly driving it. And I think that's very, very hard, but I think it's critical that we do that. We can't tell our clients what to do, but we can be rational advisors, not only in a technological way, but also about other ways as well, without seeming like social justice warriors. We can at least say things like, well, you're going to use AI in this way. Be aware that it could create these problems for you as a company. Perhaps if you have examples of how that's happened, those kind of discussions begin to get our clients to think about ethical ways to do these things. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so really, this is really a matter, all of this, of leading to the fact is what do you want the world to become in the face of AI use, widespread AI use? I think there are a couple of ways that we hear discussions around this sort of thing in technology and society that divide into two camps. There's the utopian future, in which the real cheerleaders for AI use, more wide AI use, believe that it'll solve all human problems and that it'll have only positive outcomes, what I call the utopian future. At the other extreme, there are those, and sometimes I fall into this category after watching too many dystopic movies, that it's really just going to be bad. There's only a negative outcome to the widespread use of AI. It will remove our humanity. It will force us into a future that is just going to be bad for humanity. And actually, in the extreme, this dystopian view of the world says that in the future, humans will cease to exist as relevant creatures because AI will take over. Now, I didn't invent this phrase, but I find it particularly useful. I think there's a middle ground here, and it's referred to as the protopian future by several authors. What is that? It is a future that says rationally we think about the uses of these technologies, and particularly AI in this case, which says it can help us be better. It can't help us become utopic, but it can help things become better. And because it deals with complex problems and is complex technology, it needs to be carefully envisioned and carefully planned for before it's brought out. And those problems are sometimes very, very hard. And this is hard to visualize. But thinking that falling in the camp of everything will be perfect or the camp is everything will be shit, pardon me, is I think not going to help the discussion, and in fact will lead to the discussion being avoided. I think we need to take this state, which is we say it can help us. It can help us in small ways. It can help us in large ways, but it is not leading to this utopian future where everything will be wonderful, or this dystopic future in which we say don't do this, we'll all die. So pick your outcome. I tend to fall in the middle of these things, although, as I say, if I've watched some sci-fi movies, I may fall into the dystopian view of the world. That's where I end, and I want to end on a positive note, but I don't have the answer to this other than we need to think about it. We need to be talking about it as technologists. That is that's our responsibility. We've been well trained. Society has invested a lot in us as experts in how these technologies work and how to apply them. And we're also expected, I think, as a result, we have an obligation to think about the outcomes of those and to provide our advice and consent, our advice for these things. So I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry I used up most of the hour, but let me hand it back to you and see if we want to have any questions here.
Yeah. Thanks, Rich, for taking us through this interesting session. Participants, please feel free to let us know in case of any queries through the chat and Q&A sections. We do have a couple of few minutes left. Meanwhile, Rich, as you had rightly said, that yes, it is indeed our responsibility as an individual, and more actively as a technologist, wherein we need to take part in these discussions and be part of the global forum and try a bit hand to educate more about the new technologies and how we can see the pros and cons of its usage.
Well, either I put everybody to sleep with all of that talking, or I did such an excellent job that there are no questions. I believe the former, not the latter. But if you have any questions after we're done here, please feel free to reach out. I have a passion around this issue of of technologies and what it can do and what impacts it has. So you've seen me present a number of blogs about that. I will continue to do that, and I'd be happy to engage in conversations with anyone who wants to discuss that subject.
Right. We have a query from Rick who asks, what in your opinion is the biggest risk? Is it in the technology or psychology?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would actually say it's in a third area, and maybe that's what the questioner meant by psychology. I think the biggest problem we face, and pardon me for becoming a little political here, but very much like climate change and the discussion around climate change, it would be easier for us to deny that there's a problem and a potential problem and plunge forward. I am concerned mainly about the fact that in the area I see it right now, driverless cars is a big potential problem area. That's the first place where AI and similar technologies, advanced technologies, will interact directly with humans and are likely to affect us in the next decade in just amazing ways that we can't even predict right now. I think that that will raise a number of issues and potentially, unless we deal with it up front, could either result in us just not thinking about it and plunging ahead with the technology, or I fear more that there would be a backlash when we do have these accidents with driverless cars, when things do happen. An uneducated society which has not had that discussion is likely to react very badly to it, and we may end up shutting off technologies and uses of technologies that would otherwise help us if they were carefully thought about. So I think it's mainly in the sociological area, which I guess would be psychology too.
Right. We have one more query from Andre who says, great subject, thanks. Just to add a practical thing, I know the envisioning cards has a very useful tool to have an ethical dialogue with clients during a design phase.
Oh, that's news to me. That is great news. I'd love to hear more about that, because I think if we had more formal frameworks that we can take in with us to clients in which to have that discussion, a lot of us who aren't very good at having those kinds of discussions because we're technology people, not necessarily people, would be great. So I'd love to hear more about that myself.
Right. We have one more query from GK who says, what role will policy making have when it comes to tackling dark side of AI?
I'm sorry, can you ask the question again?
Yeah. The question is, what role will policy making have when it comes to tackling dark side of AI, by G.K. Arvindan?
Great question, because, and here's how I'll answer it. If we, and I think this is actually happening in the United States right now, sadly, we're not dealing with it properly. Unless we have intelligent discussions in the public sphere, generally led by the government, because they're in a position to do that, unless we have those discussions, we are going to cede the decisions to the corporate interests. And so, in particular, this is a problem these days, I think, if you're paying close attention to Facebook. And what's happening with Facebook is there's a tussle going on now between what Facebook is doing and what the U.S. government and governments in Europe believe is the right thing to do. If we don't have those discussions and we don't have regulatory frameworks or something similar put in place, then the capital market is going to make those decisions for us, and they're going to be made for the interests of the shareholders and the corporate executives, and maybe not in our best interests. So these things will happen, and it's a question of whether or not we're willing to take part in it as members of a society, or we're just willing to sit back and let those whose interests are driven mainly by economic factors make those decisions for us. And I hope that didn't sound too political.
Thanks for answering that, Rich. So Andre says, yes, he shall contact you about the previous envisioning cards details. Oh,
that would be wonderful. I think this is also a cultural difference. I think that those sort of discussions happen likely more often in European nations than they do over here in the U.S., because we tend not to think about those. And I'd love to be able to have the tools to go in and start those conversations more. So thank you.
Great. So participants, please feel free to reach out to Rich in case of any more open queries. Thanks a lot for all your time, and thanks, Rich, for taking us through this very interesting webinar on AI and how we could tackle and deal with the current situations in this. Thanks a lot, all.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So thanks all for joining. Have a great day ahead.